Well, the topic of Christian nationalism has once again come to the forefront of a lot of conversations that are going on right now, and that's true on social media and just all over the kind of Christian sphere at the moment, and not just the Christian sphere, but it seems to be a kind of continual debate among Christians right now in questions of how it is that we are to engage in Christian civic life. Now, the reason why people are talking about it at the moment is because there was a trailer released from a new documentary that is produced by Rob Reiner of Spinal Tap fame. Now, this documentary is very clearly a critique of Christian nationalism, and at least from what I can tell, certainly not anything close to what looks like a fair critique, though I will watch it when it releases, and maybe I'll be totally surprised by the fairness of the treatment here. But what's surprising here, of course, is not that somebody who is secular and left-leaning is producing a documentary that is critical of a movement within Christianity. That kind of is something that, we would expect. But the major reason why people are talking about this is that there are a number of pretty prominent Christian figures that show up as talking heads within this documentary. So we have certain figures, David French, Russell Moore, let's see, the Holy Post hosts, Phil Vischer, the VeggieTales guy, and then Skye Jethani, I believe, was in there as well. And there were some other people that were featured in there that I personally am not really familiar with, and I'm assuming probably not part of the broader kind of what's considered evangelical world, but I could be wrong about that. I don't know. Kristen Dumais was part of this as well. So I just have some things to say about this whole discussion, and let me start off by saying this. I have never considered myself a Christian nationalist. I am not a nationalist of any kind. I don't consider myself a nationalist. So I don't know how I could be a Christian nationalist if I'm not a nationalist, but I'm certainly a Christian. So, and I will say the kind of the two books that have been written by Christian proponents who actually use the name Christian nationalism to define something that they think is a positive thing. Both of those authors have me blocked on social media, and both of those authors have said some pretty horrible things to and about me. So just to be clear, I'm not, those guys don't like me, and I'm not a proponent of that movement, and I do have serious concerns about those individuals. I do have concerns that a lot of the language, and Torba's probably been a bit more blunt about this, but a lot of the language that is used does seem to tend in the direction of a kind of ethno-nationalism rather than just a Christian nationalism. I think those are two very distinct things. So something that would be more a kind of nationalism that is religiously oriented but not race-based, I would point to Conservatism, A Rediscovery by Yoram Hazony, who's he's not a Christian, he's Jewish, but I think he has a lot of the same ideas. And I really appreciated his book, and I think he's a thoughtful guy. I don't agree with him on everything, but nonetheless, I think he's certainly a respectable guy worth reading, and I've enjoyed the things that I've read and listened to from him. So you've got these guys who are using the term Christian nationalism who have ideas, again, that I disagree with. They don't like me, and they think I'm some kind of liberal compromiser, which, whatever, that's fine. But on the other hand, then, you have people that are critiquing what they call Christian nationalism. And in their criticism of what they're calling Christian nationalism, they're really lumping all sorts of ideas together. And this is the major problem with this discussion. And I've said this from the very beginning, is when people are talking about Christian nationalism, nobody can agree on what they're talking about. So what it seems to me is that the way that this term began being used, at least in modern conversations, and I have heard it used in the past, but I think it meant actually something quite different in the past, but how I've heard it used in modern conversations, it seemed to show up to particularly identify Donald Trump and those who were arguing for more specifically Christian policies or a stronger connection between faith and the civic sphere of those who supported the presidency of Donald Trump. And it seemed that this term began to be used simply as a kind of smear or as a way to categorize a certain group of people that would not use that term in any way to identify themselves. So it showed up in more liberal media, kind of anti-Trump movements, those media outlets that really didn't like Donald Trump and his presidency, as well as didn't really like the people who were supporting him or voting for him. And so you had this Christian nationalism as this kind of blanket term to identify all sorts of people. And then there was, I think, a reaction against that. And there are different ways that you can respond, right? When you're called a name, you can respond in a couple ways. One is you could say, no, that's not accurate at all. Or you could say, fine, you're going to call me that. I'm just going to claim the name. So we had different groups of people that responded in different ways. And some eventually did do that. So the clip that you're often going to see is, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, is like, I'm a Christian nationalist. Okay, well, there is somebody in politics that would refer to herself in that way that's rather well known. But most people aren't really going to use that particular term to identify themselves, though you do have, your Stephen Wolfs and your Andrew Torbas and people who I think are on the maybe not most extreme end of things, actually, but more kind of extreme end of those conversations that are using those kind of terms as a way to self-identify. Now, so what you have then is you have a certain group of people that's self-identifying as Christian nationalists, and there are overlapping themes, but they're not all the same. And then you have a critique of what is being called Christian nationalism. And what that critique includes is far broader than, say, particularly those who are the kind of Stephen Wolfs or the Andrew Torbas, to include all of those Christians who believe that there should be an influence of Christianity in the civic sphere in certain ways. and here's part of the problem, is that those who are critical of what they're calling Christian nationalism, there often is an argument that Christianity should be somewhat engaged in the civic sphere. Well, they have to say that because these are, talking heads in a documentary about the civic sphere. So they must believe that their faith compels them to do this, but compels them to do this from a different ideological direction. And I have looked at a number of definitions of Christian nationalism to try to say, what is a Christian nationalist? And I just kind of posed this on Twitter. It's Twitter, so take it for what it is. But I just pose just in common parlance, what do people think that this idea is? How are they defining Christian nationalism? And I get responses from people who are proponents of Christian nationalism, to people who are very much leftists who hate what they call Christian nationalism, to people who are Christians who believe in the importance of Christianity in public life and in the civic sphere, but wouldn't identify themselves as Christian nationalists. And all of these people have totally different definitions of what Christian nationalism is. And even within those three groups that I mentioned, you could find two people in one of those groups that identifies Christian nationalism in a completely different way. So there is no agreed upon definition. And this really is the problem with this entire conversation, is that we're not using any clear categories. We're not clearly defining precisely what is it that is being debated. And this is for any discussion in the public sphere to have any, I wouldn't say to be productive in terms of rallying people up, because this stuff works great when you're just using rhetoric. But if you want to actually have a productive conversation, or a conversation that is actually built to try to win people over to your side, or to actually engage ideas, then you need to clearly define what you're talking about. And nobody in this conversation is defining that. At least nobody on the left that is critiquing what they're calling Christian nationalism. So when you look at what shows up just in this trailer, you've got people who are clearly white supremacists, and the implication, of course, is that you've got people with Confederate flags. The implication, in the movie is clearly they're trying to show these most extreme people, this is what Christian nationalism is. And then all of these other things are going to get lumped in. People who don't agree with certain ideas over here, you've got Alex Jones, because, we all know Alex Jones is extreme and has bizarre ideas about all sorts of things. And, you've got Confederate flags, and you've got all this stuff that's symbolism of this is bad. So now you're getting people's, hearts involved, if these are hateful, nasty people. And now all of a sudden you're starting to include all sorts of people within that label that would not affirm what Alex Jones says and would not support the Confederate South. So, or neo-Nazis, or whatever your putting under this label. So I think it's disingenuous. And frankly, I think that coming from a Christian perspective, the portrayal of groups in such a unfair and demonizing way that is not accurate to all that you are criticizing, I would say that it's sinful. It's blatantly sinful, and it's clearly sinful, because it is a misrepresentation that is purposefully there to get people riled up, to make people upset, and to identify you with the group that everyone is supposed to hate. So if you identify somebody with, well, if you believe that Christians should have some kind of, power in the public square, or that the civic order in any way should have any religious regulations. Right now we're talking about, like, should the government allow for statues of Satan in public buildings, like, which, 100 years ago, like, everyone would have thought was insane, because that has nothing to do with an understanding of pluralism within the United States historically. We've just gone very far. So what's happening is, like, you're now identifying people who are saying that, yeah, probably we shouldn't have statues of Satan. Maybe that's going a little too far. Like, you're identifying with them you're basically just literally Hitler, which is just so wild. And this is not a fair framing of the conversation. This is not helpful for anybody. And here's the problem. It's not meant to be. And this is what so much of, I think, those on the left have done, especially those within the deconstruction crowd. I'll say, I interact with leftists all the time. And, I grew up in a very leftist area. I live in a very leftist area. Those leftists who do not have a Christian background are far more respectful of me in my views than the deconstruction types. I mean, and it's not even like within the same world in terms of how they treat you. Because the deconstruction types, as much as they have said that Donald Trump has distorted everybody in the Christian world so that they're just obsessed with Donald Trump and all of their views are now dependent on Trump and it's totally distorted their faith. And I'm not saying that hasn't happened, but look in the mirror. There are so many people who have allowed this hatred towards Donald Trump, and I didn't vote for Donald Trump. To be clear, I don't like to talk about political candidates. It's not what I do, but just to throw it out there because I feel like it's going to help make the point. I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I will not be voting for Donald Trump in the next election. I am one of those people that would have called myself a never Trumper. I don't use that label anymore because now never Trumper seems to mean I support the left, which is kind of the opposite reason of why I don't support Trump. Is I think he's too far to the left. So, like, I don't get that, but that's neither here nor there. But I do want to clarify that, not because I want to tell you who I vote for. I don't like doing that, and I don't want to endorse candidates, but just to say to get ahead of what I know are going to be the responses to this. Just to clarify. So I'm not saying it from that perspective. But these people have let their kind of hatred of Trump in certain things that some of this I have significant issues with as well, but defined them in this, letting this kind of bitterness, especially the bitterness of social media, lead them toward just complete misrepresentation and hatred and anger toward the person that disagrees with them. It makes me question what their motives really are. Like when you're interacting with somebody who has views that disagree with you, say you're on the you don't like Biden, but you're gonna support him because you can't support Trump, and you still consider yourself an evangelical. And I am thinking about more the Holy Post types. I'm not trying to throw anybody in particular under the bus, but I'm trying to kind of give ideas. Probably, well, a lot of people at Christianity Today, right? I mean, we've seen kind of the political donations of Christianity Today. That certainly seems to be kind of where they're at. The question is, are these people actually trying to win people over because they think that what they're believing is wrong, and they think it's unhelpful for them, and they think that it is something that is not going to be beneficial to society? Or have they just lost that? And is it not so much, I want to win you over with a logical argument, and instead, is it, you are evil and you need to be destroyed, and I'm going to throw everything at you that I possibly can to attack you and demonize you. Because it's no longer, I want to win anyone over, it's me versus you, you are evil and I am good and I'm going to attack you. Because I want you destroyed and eradicated from public life. That's the impression that I seem to be getting. And I just got yelled at like crazy on Twitter, and I'm like, I'm getting off this for a while. It's a wild place. Yeah, it's not real life, and people act insane on there. I get it. But I recently said something about what leads a lot of men toward white nationalism, especially young men, because there is a rise, and I think that's kind of obvious in those kind of ideologies, which I think are awful. I do. I believe that's a kind of racialist ideology which believes that there is one particular group of humanity that has some kind of superiority to others. It's a demonic teaching, and it is demonic ideology. It's a demonic theology. I have not been shy about saying that. But I could take that idea, right, and seeing that going on among young men, and I could take it in two different ways. One is I could say, well, those people do that because they are evil. And the only reason that anyone would fall into a group or an ideology that I don't like is because they are evil and they need to be destroyed, and I need to use the power of my tongue and my keyboard to destroy those people and their lives. Or I can say, this is a trend that I'm seeing going on in the church and in our culture. And again, it's a dangerous trend. It's not good. But to stop and say, what is it that's leading people toward this? Why are people moving in this direction? Is there something that we can do to say, what is it that young men are seeing that is leading them toward this? That becomes a very angry and kind of hateful ideology. And I have said this many times, but I guess it was a surprise to people, on Twitter for some reason. And I think it's because it went outside of my circles, but maybe one of the reasons is because you have now a lot of young men, especially white men, but not only white men. It's men. Men are doing very poorly in general. So I don't want to say it's just white men. It's not. It's minority men also. But what you see, think about what it's like to be a young boy in school where you have constant emphasis on the kind of special treatment toward those who are considered to be oppressed classes. So in whatever way you want to take that. So some of this is women are considered oppressed, and that's, hey, half the people in the school. And now you go through all the minorities or people who, have different sexual proclivities. And I was going to say, we're talking about children here, but of course that doesn't stop anybody from talking about that stuff. So you've got all these other groups that are, they're kind of singled out as you're a minority group or you're an oppressed group, so we need to make sure that you feel, included or whatever. And then you've got a young boy who is white, and he looks around and is like, well, why am I not included? And then the way that history is often taught, American history, is this idea that the white men in history have been oppressors. And so what does a child take from that? And all these people respond are like, well, they have to understand that men, like white men, have had, privilege for many hundreds of years in this society, and that like all of this stuff happened. I'm like, okay, that's great. You can think that if you are, maybe an adult can think back and say, okay, how have white people been privileged, and how can I give up that privilege and all this other stuff? We're talking about children. Like, a kid doesn't think about that. Not that I think that approach is right anyway, but setting that aside, we're talking about kids. They don't know that. All they know is they're getting told things and I'm not, and they say some bad things about white people and what they've done, and hey, look at the color of my skin. They don't know anything beyond that. And so what does that lead to? They feel isolated. They feel like they're being attacked. They feel like they're the enemy. And sorry, look around statistically, women are doing far better than men, just in every possible metric that you can look at today. So this idea that you single out women as oppressed people all the time and men are just ignored, like women are getting more college degrees. Women in terms of mental health, are doing far better. Women are doing way better in school. And okay, you could point to, oh, but there's a bunch of male CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Most of the people graduating from your high school are not going to be running a Fortune 500 company. That's not relevant to their everyday experience. What they're seeing is the women are doing better than me in school here, and the women are doing better in terms of their mental health. Women have a lot of friends, dudes don't. And again, this is all statistically verifiable stuff. So they're not seeing things in the way that those who are in liberal academia are like looking around at societal trends in the upper echelons of society throughout many generations. So with all of that being said, you see, I'm trying to get behind why is it that people are doing this? And maybe there is a reason for this. And people are like, you're excusing Hitler if you try to say that we should understand why people are getting these movements. Like what? And all that makes me think is this. You don't want them to come out of those movements. You don't want to understand those people because you hate those people. You hate these young white men or whoever it might be that you're attacking, someone who supports Trump. You have no desire in your heart in any way to understand those people, to have an honest conversation, to lay out terms of discussion or debate, or to reach out to those people. It instead is just this complete demonization of those people because you hate them and you want them to be destroyed. And I know that sounds blunt, but man, and I'm not accusing everyone in this documentary, by the way, of believing that, but I don't know how else to read a lot of this. So if you want to have an actual conversation about how it is that Christians should engage in the public sphere, don't start with Trump. Start with, like, okay, what are the realms that God has given authority to people over? You've got in the Lutheran Church, we speak about the church, the family, and the state. Okay, as Christians, we believe these are three things that God instituted. These are the three pillars of society. And then we start to ask, okay, how has God divided the responsibility of those three estates? What is the responsibility of government versus the responsibility of the church versus the responsibility of family? We can outline those things and debate that. And then we can say, okay, if we're talking about the role of the state and its role in enforcing the law, which throughout history has been God's moral law. The question was never in the past the question of, well, should the state enforce God's moral law? The question in the past was always, what aspects of God's moral law have been given to the state? The questions of, well, does that mean, religious tests or those kinds of things? Like, should the state, from a Christian perspective, punish heresy? Should state allow for a variety of kinds of worship because the state's role is primarily in terms of, the second table of the law or protecting life or whatever it might be? But the conversation has never been, until a lot of what I'm seeing today, at least on social media, which is, does God's law have anything to say to the state at all? Or should the state be governed by something else? Which I don't really know how you come to that perspective as a Christian. But instead it was, well, what aspects of the law? How is it to impose the law? What's the role of the law in terms of the state? What is the relationship that God has given between church and state? And none of those questions are really being asked. It's just jump into attack mode. And if you don't start with just the basic, just categories and conversations and all of this kind of stuff that needs to be done to have a productive argument or debate, which I don't think these people are looking for, you have to lay all this stuff out. So this is just some of my frustration, and feel free to yell at me in the comments. That's fine. I'm not going to yell at you back, but go ahead if you feel like that does something. It does help the algorithm if you comment, even if you say nasty things. So that's great. All right. Well, thanks so much for watching. And if you want to see more content like this, please do subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.